Hello and welcome to the Trade Generation. I'm Jay Cameron, and today we'll be discussing drywall floating, sanding, and finishing. This is part 2 of our drywall mini-series, and we'll leave a link to part 1 here so you can see how we got from a hole in the wall to where we are today. Today for our sanding, we're going to be using these 3M dust channeling sanding sponges in 60 and 120 grit. And for our texture today, we'll be using this Home Max Pro Grade Orange Peel wall texture. Alright guys, jumping back into our example board over here. We're going to work like we did last time, starting from the smallest, moving our way up to the largest. So, with our nail screw holes, all you have to do is take your 120 grit sanding block, just give it a light sand over top of it. Make sure it's flat, and now it's ready to get painted. You are done with that. Moving on to our small holes now, a little more sanding at the 120. Light pressure against the board and make sure all of your edges are smoothed down, no high spots, no ridges. And as soon as you accomplish that, this is ready for a little bit of texture, which we will come back to later. Now moving on to medium holes and anything where you have to float a little bit with your patches, you have to start worrying a little bit more about your edges, ridges, and high spots inside of your patch. So a great thing to use while you're working is a small light. You can see all the little spots and imperfections inside of your patch from all angles. It gives you a good idea of what you need to do and where you need to do it. And you don't need too much pressure whenever you're doing this. Just put it against it, a little bit of pressure behind it, and let the sanding block do the work. Especially when you have an aggressive grit like 60, you don't need to put too much pressure on it or else you're gonna get it right through the drywall mud that you laid before and into your tape. Small ridge right here. So just go ahead, take your sanding block and start working those away. All right, check it again. Looking pretty good. Nice and flat all the way around. All right, now that we have our drywall at this stage, what we're gonna do is move up to our 120 grit to get rid of any of those scratches that might be in there, any sort of divots. Just clean it up and get it a little bit flatter, smoother, so it's ready for texture. All right, so take your 120 grit sanding block and lightly work your way across the patch. I'm using even less pressure with this one than I was with the 60. We're not trying to really sand down anything anymore. We're just trying to smooth up the surface. All right, that patch is looking pretty good now. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna take a microfiber cloth, clean up any dust that might be on there, and then we'll be ready for texture in the next step. Okay, moving on to our large hole that we worked on last time. As you can see, it's a little bit inset from the rest of the drywall around it. Plus we still have a little bit of this tape exposed right here. All that means is we don't want to spend too much time around those areas because if we start sanding through that tape, it's going to create a lot of issues for us. So what we're going to do, go back to our 60 grit right here and start working your way around the edges, lightly work over any of the tape areas that might be exposed, and then just try to take down any of these little ridges, bubbles, any of this stuff. Just allow me to emphasize, this requires a lot of patience. But don't worry, because if you give your patience now, it's going to pay off in the final product later. All right, and once you stop being able to see the imperfections with your naked eye, take out your light and reveal the truth. We got a pretty large ridge around here. I'm going to lightly try to take it down, especially around the edges where the tape's a little exposed. Down here you can see that the patch is still inset a bit from the surrounding wall. So all you want to make sure is that any sort of high spots are taken down and the rest we can float out later. right, this one's looking pretty good now. So, wipe this down and they'll be ready to start floating. All right, now we're moving on to our complete replacement. This one's pretty simple and straightforward. Once again, just taking down any ridges or high spots you have to make sure you focus a little more around the edges of your tape, and don't forget to get your screw holes. All right, when you're sanding down these edges, here's an example of what you do want to see. There's no ridges, no high spots around the edges right here. It's almost disappearing into the texture that's already there. Versus over here, where you can see it's definitely above the surrounding wall texture, and it's going to create a lot of eyesores whenever you leave that alone. So you want to make sure you take that down and get rid of those ridges. All right, sticker light. Couple ridges right around the tape edge there. Looking pretty good through this part. Another small ridge right here. And let's take down these edges a little bit more. All right, now we're moving on to drywall floating. You're gonna need your mud pan and knives, some drywall mud. Let's get going. All right, let's grab some all-purpose joint compound, throw her in the pan. We're not gonna thin this stuff down. I want it to be as substantial as possible so it's able to fill in any of the surface we need to fill in. All right, once we're mixed up, scrape off your excess, push that to the side, grab your 8-inch taping knife. All right, start filling it in. All right, now that we got that mud in there and spread around, let's take our 12-inch skimming knife, grab a little bit more, and now we're gonna be using this knife to float and skim this across nice and flat. And the way we're gonna do that is by using the existing surface as a reference point. Put the middle of it right in the middle of your tape joint. And then we'll take that line, keep it going across. Top edge, same thing. Basically everything that was inset has now been flushed up with the rest of the surface. All right, for our complete replacement right here, as you can see, we don't need to fill in too much. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put something called a skim coat on top of it. It's gonna be a very thin layer of mud that's gonna cover up any of these tape edges or any other sort of small imperfections that are existing. So let's get some more mud in our pan here. Just need a little bit. Said it's a thin coat. So we're gonna take this and just a small amount of water to thin it up even more. Just like that. All right. So now we're gonna take our 12-inch skimming knife and much the same we did the last one. We're gonna try to put this towards the middle and just let the knife do the work. don't know if I put enough emphasis on it needs to be thin layer of mud. It flows off of our knife. 2 fingers of pressure. And take off all that excess. All right, we got all of our tape edges that were exposed, all the little holes and divots that are in there. It's a thin layer of mud, so it's going to dry quickly. So we move on to our next step like that. Now we're moving on to the texturing stage. Today we'll be using this water-based orange peel spray texture. This is a great option for the average homeowner as it requires less of an upfront investment and a shorter learning curve than the traditional hopper. There's a couple of tips and tricks that I'm going to show you today that can get you a better result and return on your investment. Now what's great about this can of spray texture is you can actually affect the way you're spraying. As you can see here, it shows you the texture from fine to medium to heavy by moving around this nozzle up front. You can also affect the pressure using this little switch back here. Now before we can actually start spraying the texture, we need to shake this up because the contents will get separated as it sits on the shelf. So what we're going to do, turn it upside down and give it about 2 minutes of vigorous shaking. And before you start spraying, make sure you spray a test area first. You want to know what you're working with before you start putting it on your work surface. So we're going to back off a good bit. All right, as you can see, we have good spread, good shape and formation, and we got out all of that starting off stuff that builds up and just basically shoots straight up liquid on what you're dealing with. So, now we know we're working with something that's good. Let's turn it around and spray it on our work surface. All right, you want to make sure you have an open and clean surface before you start spraying. And for the small stuff here, what we're going to do, we're going to knock our pressure down a little bit and go more towards a fine medium type of texture. You want to make sure you're backed off a few feet. If you get too close to your spray texture, it's going to have a high impact velocity, which is going to cause more bubbling and more product to build up in one area than you want. I'm only going to be pressing the trigger down about halfway. Aim at what you're shooting. Just like that, you have enough texture for those 2 small holes. For our medium hole patch over here, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by using a very fine texture to fill up most of the area. And then afterwards, we'll use the heavier texture to kind of spread it out a bit and make it look more natural. So, start at one of your corners, aim a little bit past it, and we're going to work this in small circles as you're shooting. All right, small, fine texture on there. Let that dry and set up a little bit before we move on to our heavy stuff. While keeping our pressure low, we're going to move our nozzle up here to more of a medium heavy texture. And since this is dried and set up a little bit now, we're going to go ahead and throw another coat on top of that. You want to make sure you don't build up too much in one area because it will cause a lot of bubbles and pitting if you do that. So spread it out evenly so everything can dry. And now that the skim coat is completely dried on our complete replacement, we're going to go ahead and sand it down once more, this time using our 120 grit sanding block. Now we're looking pretty good. It's ready for texture. Okay, let's go on to sanding this float coat using our 120 grit sanding block. Across larger areas like this, it might be easier for you to work in circles with the sponge. And if you have some spots that are super high like this up here, you can swap out your 120 grit, your 60 grit. so we can take down more material at the same time. It's looking pretty good. Let's get some texture on it. All right, going back to low pressure and fine texture. Once again, you're going to work in little circles whenever you're shooting. Give yourself a few feet of space and have fun. We're gonna go ahead and do the complete replacement while we're at it. All right, let's have it for a couple minutes. We'll go back to some heavier texture. Now that the first layer is dried up a little bit, crank this back over to a medium heavy. Let's go for it. Let that sit there and dry. All right, now we have the beautiful result of all of our hard work paid off. Last thing we have to do before paint, take our 120 grit sanding block, and if I have not said it enough, lightly sand this texture. I am barely pressing on this sanding block, put it up against there, and just keep it against the wall. And now the look you're going for is basically like a frosted oatmeal cookie. So right there you can see we are not flattening out this texture at all. All we're doing is just taking off the high parts of it to make everything even across. So once again, we're looking for this sort of frosted oatmeal cookie look. And whenever you rub your hand against it, you shouldn't feel getting caught in anything. There should be no edges really, just a nice smooth bumps going across there. Whenever you're sanding texture, I find you get the best results sanding in a circle, much like the way you applied it. It allows you to get it from many different angles and you don't rub too hard, too deep into your texture. And there you have it, guys. It has now been textured and sanded. Let's grab a paint roller, touch up paint. Let's finish this one up. All right, let's allow that coat of paint to dry for a little while. And we'll come back and top it off with a second coat. And there we have it, folks. We've gone from a hole to a wall like new. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. We got plenty more tutorials coming up soon. We have videos of trade insights coming up as well. Plenty more content in the works. Follow us on Instagram. We post there almost every day. Stay safe, work hard. We hope to see you out in the field.